the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the early part of last week, Professor Blunt was publicly identified.
I'm sorry to interrupt the Prime Minister, but I had intended to make this statement to the House before the debate begins, and I think it is important. I apologise for interrupting the Right Honourable Lady. As the House knows, it is the general rule that matters which would entail legislation must not be discussed on a motion for the adjournment. However, as I reminded the House on Monday, I am given discretion under Standing Order number 16 to permit incidental reference to legislative action when enforcement of the prohibition would unduly restrict discussion. I propose today to exercise this discretion in respect of the general matter of the possible modification of the Official Secrets Act. In the Prime Minister's written reply to a question by the Honourable Member for Hartlepool, reference was made to information conveyed to the Palace. I therefore think it wise at this stage to draw the attention of the House to our well-established rule that any references to the royal family must be phrased in courteous language and must not reflect upon the conduct of the sovereign. This does not, however, inhibit the full discussion of any advice which may or may not have been given to Her Majesty. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the early part of last week, Professor Blunt was publicly identified as having been a suspect Soviet agent. This disclosure understandably gave rise to grave concern. Last Thursday, in response to a priority written question from the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Hartlepool, I thought it right to confirm that Professor Blunt had indeed been a Soviet agent and to give the House the salient facts. Today, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity to debate the whole matter. It may be convenient, therefore, if I start by setting out the facts in greater detail. Professor Blunt has admitted that he was recruited for Russian intelligence when he was at Cambridge before the war. In 1940, he joined the Security Service. To us today, it seems extraordinary that a man who had made no secret of his Marxist beliefs could have been accepted for secret work in any part of the public service, let alone the Security Service. But that is with the benefit of hindsight. Perhaps standards were relaxed because it was a time of considerable expansion and recruitment to deal with the wartime tasks of the service, which were directed against Hitler's Germany. Professor Blunt has said that during his period in the Security Service from 1940 to 1945, he regularly passed to Russian intelligence anything that came his way which would be of interest to them. We do not know exactly what information he passed. We do know, however, to what information he had access by virtue of his duties. There is no doubt that British interests were seriously damaged by his activities. But it is unlikely that British military operations or British lives were put at risk. Further, the story that he jeopardized the lives of secret agents in the Netherlands is without foundation. He was never in the Special Operations Executive. After he left the Security Service in 1945 and resumed his career as an art historian, Professor Blunt ceased to have access to classified information. He has said that from 1945 to 1951, he passed no information to the Russians. In May 1951, an investigation which had continued for some years caught up with Donald Maclean. It was Philby who warned Burgess to tell Maclean that he was about to be interrogated. and it was Burgess who used Blunt as a contact with a Soviet controller to help with the arrangements for Maclean's flight to Russia, a journey in which he was joined by Burgess. Blunt admits that on one occasion, between 1951 and 1956, he assisted Philby in contacting Russian intelligence. He has said that he has had no contact with Russian intelligence since then. The defection of Burgess and Maclean led to intense and prolonged investigations of the extent to which the security and other public services had been infiltrated by Russian intelligence. At an early stage in these investigations, Professor Blunt came under inquiry. This was as a result of information to the effect that Burgess had been heard in 1937 to say that he was working for a secret branch of the Comintern and that Blunt was one of his sources. Blunt denied this. Nevertheless, he remained under suspicion and became the subject of intensive investigation. He was interviewed on 11 occasions over the following 8 years. He persisted in his denial, and no evidence against him was obtained. Of course, until his confession, the authorities did not know the extent of his involvement with the Russians or the period over which it lasted. It was early in 1964 that new information was received relating to an earlier period which directly implicated Blunt. I can't disclose the nature of that information, but it was not usable as evidence on which to base a prosecution. In this situation, the security authorities were faced with a difficult choice. They could have decided to wait in the hope that further information, which could be used as a basis for prosecuting Blunt, would in due course be discovered. But the security authorities had already pursued their inquiries for nearly 13 years without obtaining firm evidence against Blunt. There was no reason to expect or hope that a further wait would be likely to yield evidence of a kind which had eluded them so far. Alternatively, they could have confronted Professor Blunt with the new information to see if it would break his denial. But Blunt had persisted in his denial at 11 interviews. The security authorities had no reason to suppose that he would do otherwise at a 12th. If the security authorities had confronted him with the new information and he still persisted in his denial, their investigation of him would have been no further forward, and they might have prejudiced their own position by alerting him to information which he could then use to warn others.